I flew 12 hours to attend my sister Brianna's wedding. At the venue, my parents stopped me. Only family is allowed, they said. You were not invited, leave. Heartbroken, I left. 2 days later, my mom called. The bill is $338,000. How will you pay? I laughed and told her exactly what she had done. My mom gasped. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. I am Jada. I am 32 years old and I work as a senior executive in financial restructuring and distressed debt acquisition. It is a highly demanding, intensely powerful career, but my family has always dismissed it as boring corporate desk work. Growing up in our household meant constantly competing for approval I would never receive. My father, DeAndre, is a prominent megachurch pastor in Atlanta. He built his entire reputation on community activism, but behind closed doors, he treated his congregation like a personal bank account. My mother, Yvonne, is entirely obsessed with high society. She spends all her time trying to impress the elite African American social clubs, desperately seeking validation through designer clothes and expensive galas. Then there is my younger sister, Brianna. At 28, she is a local beauty queen who has never worked a challenging job in her life. She is the undisputed golden child. Everything I achieved was ignored while every minor thing Brianna did was celebrated. When I paid my own way through college, my parents did not even attend my graduation. But when Brianna won a minor pageant, they threw a catering event that cost thousands of dollars. The heavy Georgia humidity hit my face the moment I stepped out of my black vehicle. I had just landed from a grueling 12-hour flight from London, dragging my suitcase up the sweeping cobblestone driveway of the most exclusive wedding venue in Atlanta. I was exhausted, but I was pushing through because it was Brianna's wedding day. She was marrying Trent. Trent is 30 years old, a white finance bro who projects an image of massive real estate wealth. My parents worshipped him. They believed marrying Trent was Brianna's ultimate ticket into elite, untouchable white wealth. I reached the massive mahogany double doors, ready to put our differences aside and celebrate. But the doors pulled open to reveal a blockade. My mother Yvonne and my father DeAndre stood firmly in the entrance. DeAndre stood tall and imposing in a custom-tailored tuxedo. Yvonne wore an incredibly expensive emerald green gown. She took one look at my professional travel suit and curled her lip in absolute disgust. "What are you doing here?" Yvonne demanded, her voice an angry, hushed whisper so the wealthy guests inside would not hear. "You are not on the guest list." I stared at her, adjusting my grip on my heavy luggage. I replied that it is my sister's wedding, and I asked what she meant about me not being on the list. My mother crossed her arms tightly. "Only real family is allowed inside today. You were not invited, Jada. Leave right now before Trent's family sees you looking like a tired corporate drone. You are going to embarrass us." I looked directly at the emerald gown she was wearing. I asked her if she meant the tired corporate drone who paid for that exact dress she was wearing. I kept my voice dangerously calm. I reminded her that I distinctly remember clearing a $5,000 charge on her credit card just last week so it would not bounce and humiliate her at the boutique. I told her she was welcome. My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest to intimidate me. He told me not to speak to my mother like that. He said they all knew I was just jealous. He boasted that Brianna was marrying into elite wealth today, claiming Trent comes from real money and real society. He declared that they would not let my bitter single-woman energy ruin Brianna's entry into the upper class. He told me to go back to my boring little desk job and let my sister shine. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for entry, to plead for their love the way I did when I was a desperate teenager. But I was no longer the scapegoat daughter begging for their crumbs of affection. I looked at the two of them standing there guarding a borrowed castle, and I felt nothing but absolute crystal-clear realization. I did not shed a single tear. I simply nodded, turned on my heel, and walked right back down the sweeping driveway toward my waiting vehicle. I climbed into the back seat of my vehicle and opened my laptop. I needed to check my corporate accounts and get back to work. Just as the screen lit up, my phone rang. It was my executive assistant, Alexis. "Boss, we have a massive red flag." Alexis said, her voice tight with absolute urgency. Someone just used your social security number to guarantee a $338,000 line of credit. The charge is listed under an Atlanta luxury wedding venue. They bypassed the initial security check by using your old childhood address and your mother's maiden name as the security answers. I stared at the dashboard of my car, the leather seats suddenly feeling very cold. My own parents had stolen my identity. They blocked me from the venue, called me a jealous corporate drone, and simultaneously used my name to foot the bill for their golden child's extravagant lifestyle. My father, the supposedly righteous community leader, and my mother, the ultimate social climber, had just crossed the line from toxic parenting into outright federal crime. I asked Alexis to pull up the exact details of the credit application. She read off the vendor agreements, the lavish floral arrangements, the imported champagne, the custom ice sculptures. Every single luxury my mother had boasted about online was sitting squarely on my credit profile. They assumed that because I made good money, I would just quietly absorb the cost to avoid a public family scandal. They thought I would be too ashamed to expose them. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I am not a soft target. I buy and dismantle failing companies for a living. I thrive in high-stakes corporate warfare. And my parents had just handed me the loaded weapon. Before I could give Alexis her next set of instructions, a sharp tapping sound echoed through the quiet cabin of my vehicle. I looked up from my laptop screen. Standing outside my tinted window was Camilla Trent's mother. She was draped in beige silk, a condescending smile plastered across her face. I rolled down the window just enough to hear her. Camilla leaned in the heavy scent of expensive floral perfume invading my car. "Excuse me," Camilla said, her tone dripping with that specific brand of polite arrogance unique to old money pretenders. "Are you the catering staff? We are missing 2 bags of crushed ice for the raw bar. If you could just run around to the service entrance and unload them, that would be fantastic." I stared at her, processing the sheer audacity of her assumption. I told her clearly that I am not the caterer and that I am Brianna's sister. Camilla's eyes widened in exaggerated surprise, her gaze sweeping over my professional travel suit and then resting pointedly on my natural hair. "Oh," she breathed out, a fake nervous little laugh following her realization. "My apologies. I just assumed because of your very natural, untamed hair. It is so bold of you to wear it like that to a formal event. You just blend right in with the service crew." Before I could verbally dismantle Camilla and her racist microaggression, the grand doors of the venue flew open again. My mother came sprinting down the driveway, her heavy emerald gown catching around her ankles. She looked completely panicked, terrified that I was going to ruin her precarious standing with her new wealthy white in-laws. "Camilla, darling," Yvonne gasped, inserting herself between my car window and Trent's mother. "Is everything all right down here?" Camilla gave a dismissive little wave of her hand. "Yes, Yvonne. I was just asking this young woman about the ice delivery, but she claims she is your daughter." "Is that true?" I watched my mother's face contort. This was her moment to claim me, to defend her flesh and blood against a blatant, offensive insult. Instead, she chose the social ladder. Yvonne let out a high-pitched, artificial laugh. "Oh, Camilla, please forgive her. This is Jada. She is always making things awkward. She was just leaving. She knows she does not belong here today." Yvonne turned to me, her eyes flashing with absolute venom. "Drive away, Jada. Now. Stop loitering and making us look bad in front of important people." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or cause the scene she was so desperate to avoid. I simply reached up and tapped the small high-definition dash camera mounted behind my rearview mirror, ensuring the green recording light was solid. The camera captured high-quality audio and video of the entire exchange. It recorded Camilla's racist assumptions, and it recorded my mother aggressively shooing me away like a stray dog to protect her fragile social climbing. I rolled the window up right in my mother's furious face, blocking out her toxic energy. The heavy glass sealed me inside my quiet, air-conditioned sanctuary. The phone was still connected to Alexis, who had heard the entire interaction through the vehicle's audio system. "Boss," Alexis asked tentatively over the speaker, "do you want me to call the fraud department and decline the charge? I can shut it down right now and flag the account for identity theft." I watched through this tinted glass as my mother linked arms with Camilla. They were laughing together, guiding each other back toward the grand doors, completely oblivious to the massive financial and legal avalanche hovering directly over their heads. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded me while using my money to fund their fantasy. No, Alexis. I said, my voice dangerously calm and precise. Do not decline the charge. Do not flag the account just yet. Let the $338,000 transaction clear completely. Let them drink the expensive champagne. Let them eat the catered food. Let them sign the final vendor agreements with my stolen social security number. Let them enjoy every single second of this fake elitist wedding. Alexis paused on the other end of the line. But Jada, if we let it clear, they are committing a massive crime. Once they sign those final venue release forms, it is no longer just a declined card. I smiled a slow, cold smile that never reached my eyes. Exactly, I replied. Let them commit federal wire fraud. Document every timestamp, every online address they used to sign the digital contracts, and every single cent they authorized. I want the paper trail to be absolutely bulletproof. They wanted to play high society games using my name and my credit history. I am going to let them dig a hole so deep that not even my father's entire megachurch congregation can pray them out of it. We are not just going to cancel a credit card, Alexis. We are going to let them walk right into a federal indictment. The engine of my vehicle purred to life. I told my driver to take me back to the airport. I was flying straight to my Atlanta corporate office to prepare the legal documents. As the luxury wedding venue disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. For years, I had tolerated their emotional abuse. I had endured the constant comparisons to Brianna, the local pageant queen, who had never worked a hard day in her life. I had listened to my father preach from his pulpit about integrity while secretly draining the pockets of working-class families to fund his lavish lifestyle. I had watched my mother bow and scrape for the approval of people like Camilla and Harrison, people who secretly despised her but tolerated her because of the church's perceived wealth. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the family failure because I chose to build a tangible, highly profitable business instead of chasing empty social clout. Now they had finally crossed the ultimate legal line. They had committed grand larceny and aggravated identity theft against a financial executive who specialized in dismantling corrupt organizations. The trap was set. The bait was taken, and all I had to do now was wait for their honeymoon phase to come crashing down. 2 days later, the morning sun bounced off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my Atlanta corner office. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk looking out over the city skyline. I had spent the last 48 hours tracking every digital footprint my parents and sister left behind. On my secondary monitor, Brianna's social media feed was running a continuous loop of fabricated luxury. She was posting dozens of highly edited photos wearing designer resort wear, holding tropical drinks, and tagging the location as an exclusive private island in the Maldives. Living my best life with my wealthy husband, she captioned one photo of her and Trent clinking crystal glasses. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and zoomed in on the background of her latest post. The distinctive marble pillars and the very specific pattern of the balcony railing gave it away instantly. They were not in the Maldives. They had not even left the state of Georgia. Trent's supposed generational wealth could not even stretch far enough to buy a pair of international first-class plane tickets. They were hiding out in the honeymoon suite at the St. Regis Hotel right here in Buckhead, pretending to be halfway across the world. It was a pathetic display of fake prosperity, perfectly matching the foundation of their entire relationship. The intercom on my desk buzzed, breaking the silence. My assistant Alexis spoke through the speaker, her voice tight with anticipation. Jada, the venue management, just finalized the billing contracts. The total charge has hit the corporate verification system. The trap had officially snapped shut. Almost immediately, my personal cell phone began vibrating across the desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the moment before I finally pressed accept. Yvonne did not bother with a polite greeting. She launched straight into a frantic, breathless demand. The final wedding bill is $338,000. She snapped, her voice echoing through my quiet office. We put your name on the guarantor line, Jada. The venue management is processing the final clearance today, and your bank is holding up the transfer. You make more than enough at your little desk job to cover this. Pay it right now before they ruin our reputation and kick your sister out of her honeymoon suite. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the Atlanta skyline. I asked her calmly why she thought I would ever pay a single cent for a wedding I was physically barred from attending. Because it is your duty to this family. Yvonne shrieked, her panic masking her usual polished Southern belle tone. Trent's parents are elite members of society. They expect a certain standard of luxury that Brianna deserves. We had to show them that our family can match their financial power. If you do not authorize this payment right now, I will stand at the pulpit this Sunday and tell the entire megachurch congregation what a bitter, jealous, ungrateful daughter you are. I will make sure you are shunned from every social circle in Atlanta. Her threat was so predictably vile I actually felt a genuine smile spread across my face. I reminded her of a winter night 14 years ago. I asked her if she remembered when I was 18 working a double shift at a diner to pay for my college textbooks. I had fallen on the ice outside our house and fractured my wrist. Instead of taking me to the hospital, she took the last $500 from my savings jar to pay for Brianna's expedited entry fee for the Miss Georgia Peach pageant. I had to set my own wrist with a drugstore splint and keep working. She sacrificed my physical health so Brianna could wear a plastic crown. That was entirely different. Yvonne scoffed, entirely missing the point. Brianna needed that platform to secure a good husband. Look at her now. She is married to a real estate heir while you are sitting alone in some cubicle. You owe us for raising you. Now call your bank and force this payment through immediately. I let out a low, dark laugh that made Yvonne stop mid-rant. It was a laugh completely devoid of warmth or submission. Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. You really do not understand what I do for a living, do you? You thought I was just some low-level accountant making decent money. You thought you could simply forge my signature, use my social security number, and hide behind your title as the pastor's wife. What are you talking about? Yvonne demanded, her voice trembling slightly. Just clear the charge, Jada. Do not make this complicated. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool mahogany desk. I am not clearing anything, Mom. You did not just forge a signature on a standard consumer credit card. You used my private identification, which is legally bound to my status as a senior executive of a distressed debt acquisition firm. My social security number is tied directly to a federally insured corporate entity that manages hundreds of millions of dollars in highly regulated assets. The line went dead silent. The only sound was Yvonne's shallow, panicked breathing over the receiver. When you forged my name to guarantee a $338,000 luxury wedding bill, I continued, my tone absolutely surgical, you tripped a massive anti-laundering protocol. You triggered a federal banking alert on a federally insured corporate account. The Banking Commission flagged it as a high-level corporate embezzlement attempt. This is no longer just a family dispute over a wedding bill. This is a federal crime. Jada, please, Yvonne whispered, all the arrogance suddenly stripped from her voice. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was authorized by you. We can fix this if you just make the phone call. I cannot do that, Mom, I replied. Because they have already initiated their automatic asset protection protocols. And since you linked the venue's payment gateway through the church's operational account to make yourselves look wealthier to Trent's parents, the system followed the digital trail right back to your source of funds. The FBI just froze the megachurch's operational funds. Every single bank account tied to Dad's ministry is currently locked by federal authorities, pending a full criminal investigation. I listened to the sound of a glass shattering on the other end of the line, followed by Yvonne's breathless, horrified gasp. The honeymoon was officially over. Less than an hour after my phone call with Yvonne, my office doors burst open. My receptionist gave a startled cry as two men shoved past her desk and stormed directly into my executive suite. It was my father, DeAndre, and my brand-new brother-in-law, Trent. DeAndre was still wearing his tailored pastoral suit, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. Trent marched right beside him, exuding that toxic brand of unchecked white privilege he used like a weapon. He wore a designer polo shirt and expensive loafers, looking every bit the wealthy tech founder he pretended to be. Trent did not wait for an invitation. He marched straight up to my massive mahogany desk and slammed both of his palms down hard on the polished wood. He leaned over, looming, trying to use his height and his race to physically intimidate me in my own corporate headquarters. "Listen here, you single bitter woman," Trent barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are going to pick up that phone and unfreeze my father-in-law's accounts right now. If you do not fix this little tantrum of yours, my family will ruin you in this city. You will never work in Atlanta finance again." I did not flinch. I did not lean back in my leather chair or break eye contact. I simply looked at his hands planted on my desk, then looked up at his red, sweating face. I asked Trent exactly what family he thought was going to ruin me. I asked him if he meant the same family whose ancestral wealth he had completely squandered. DeAndre stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Jada, you have lost your mind," my father roared, his booming preacher voice vibrating with artificial authority. "You are disrespecting your family, and you are disrespecting your sister's husband." Trent is a highly successful tech entrepreneur. His family holds real power in this state. You are going to trigger a scandal that could destroy my ministry. Call your bank and tell them it was an accounting error right now before I disown you for good. I rested my chin on my steepled fingers and smiled at the man who had spent my entire life calling me a disappointment. I told my father that he could not disown someone who had already bought and sold his entire net worth before breakfast. Then I turned my attention back to the angry, entitled man leaning over my desk. I told Trent to take his hands off my furniture before I had my security team throw him through the glass partition. Trent stood up straight but kept his arrogant glare fixed on me. He told me I was just jealous because Brianna was beautiful and managed to secure a man with real generational wealth while I was rotting away in a cubicle. He sneered that I was just an angry woman who could not stand to see her younger sister elevate the family status. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick red folder. I dropped it onto the desk with a heavy thud. I told Trent that his generational wealth was the funniest joke I had heard all year. I opened the folder and spread the documents out for both of them to see. I looked right at my father and asked him if he knew where the church building fund had actually gone over the past 3 years. DeAndre's face suddenly went rigid. The loud, booming pastor routine vanished in an instant, replaced by the terrified silence of a cornered thief. I explained exactly what I had uncovered during my distressed debt acquisitions. Trent never had a successful tech startup. His company went completely bankrupt 36 months ago. He had been drowning in venture capital debt and facing massive lawsuits from his original investors. I watched Trent's arrogant sneer falter as I read off the exact dollar amounts of his liabilities. I turned back to my father. I told DeAndre that he had been systematically filtering tithes from working-class black families in his congregation straight into Trent's empty bank accounts. My father had been stealing from his own people, the very community that trusted him for spiritual guidance, to fund the lavish lifestyle of a white con artist, just so Yvonne could brag to her social club about having a wealthy son-in-law. DeAndre had sacrificed the financial stability of single mothers and hardworking parishioners to buy Brianna a seat at a table that did not even exist. "That is a lie," DeAndre stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper as he stared at the highlighted bank transfers. "Trent is restructuring his portfolio. It was an investment for the church. It was a secure investment for your sister's future." I asked my father, since when does a church investment involve paying off a leased Porsche and buying fake diamond tennis bracelets for Brianna? I pointed to the bank statements highlighting the wire transfers made directly from the church's charitable outreach fund to Trent's personal creditors. I told them they were both pathetic. DeAndre sold out his integrity for fake proximity to whiteness, and Trent used his privilege to scam a desperate, socially obsessed pastor. Trent's face was completely pale now. He backed away from my desk, running a hand through his hair. He tried to muster up one last threat, telling me I had illegally accessed his financial records and that he was going to sue me for everything I owned. He claimed his family lawyers would bury me in litigation until I was bankrupt. I slid the red folder directly across the desk until it touched the edge right in front of Trent. I shook my head and told him I did not need to hack anything. My firm specializes in distressed debt and non-performing loans. I told Trent that his creditors got so tired of his bounced checks that they auctioned off his debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought it all. I own his failed company. I own the lease on his luxury car. I own every single financial liability he has. Trent stared at the red folder, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation finally crashed down on him. His fake empire was entirely in my hands. I picked up my pen and looked at the two men standing powerless in my office. I told Trent I was not the one freezing his accounts. The Securities and Exchange Commission was already doing that. I smiled and delivered the final blow. I told Trent he should probably check his phone, because while he was busy storming into my office trying to intimidate me, the St. Regis Hotel had just tried to process the charge for his extravagant room service breakfast in the honeymoon suite. His credit card had just declined. I did not wait for Trent to process his humiliation in my office. I pressed the security button under my desk and watched with absolute satisfaction as two towering guards escorted my father and my brand new brother-in-law out of my corporate headquarters. My father was shouting empty threats about respect and family values, but his voice quickly faded behind the heavy glass doors. I grabbed my tailored trench coat and my car keys. I was certainly not going to miss the sequel to this meltdown. I instructed my driver to take me straight down Peachtree Road to the St. Regis Hotel. I wanted a front row seat to the exact moment Brianna realized her golden ticket was printed on counterfeit paper. I walked into the grand marble lobby holding a freshly brewed iced latte. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. You could hear the screaming before you even passed the crystal chandeliers. There was my sister Brianna standing at the front reception desk, throwing an absolute tantrum. She was dressed in a silk resort set that probably cost more than my first car, waving her perfectly manicured hands in the face of a very calm, very unbothered hotel manager. Behind the counter sat a mountain of Brianna's designer luggage stacked together like prisoners of war. The manager spoke in a hushed, professional tone, explaining that he could not release her baggage until the outstanding balance for the honeymoon suite, the couple's massage, and the imported caviar breakfast was settled in full. Brianna slammed her hands on the marble counter, demanding they run the card again. She claimed her husband was a tech billionaire who would buy the entire building and fire them all. I took a slow sip of my iced latte and watched her delusion unravel in real time. It was a beautiful disaster. Brianna spun around in a blind rage, looking for someone to project her humiliation onto. Her eyes locked onto me, standing calmly by the grand piano. Her face contorted into a mask of pure venom. She abandoned the receptionist and charged across the grand lobby, her heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. "You miserable monster," Brianna screamed, completely abandoning her polished pageant queen persona. "You did this to me. You canceled my cards because you are a bitter, ugly woman. You are just trying to ruin my marriage because no man will ever look at you." She raised her hand and swung at my face, aiming a vicious slap meant to tear me down in front of a dozen wealthy onlookers. I did not flinch. I reached out and caught her wrist in midair. I squeezed her delicate wrist tightly, effortlessly, stopping her momentum and forcing her to look directly into my eyes. She gasped, trying to pull away, but my grip was like iron. I leaned in close so only she could hear the cold truth in my voice. "Take a good look at me, Brianna," I whispered sharply. "Look at the woman you are trying to hit. 10 years ago, you stole $2,000 from the high school treasury to buy fake IDs and expensive liquor for your friends. When the principal started an investigation, you planted the empty cash box in my backpack. You framed me to protect your precious reputation. Mom and Dad knew you did it, but they forced me to kneel on our living room floor and apologize to you. They made me take the blame so you would not lose your crown." I looked her up and down, my grip tightening just a fraction more. "I am not that scared teenager anymore. Nobody is ever going to force me to kneel for you again." I shoved her arm back, letting her stumble backward in her ridiculous silk outfit. "You wanted to live like a billionaire," I said loudly enough for the hotel staff to hear. "Then pay your own bills." Before Brianna could unleash another scream, the lobby doors slid open. Trent came running through the entrance, drenched in sweat. His designer polo was stained, and his perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. He looked absolutely frantic. He had just run all the way from my office building, having realized his entire facade was collapsing. Brianna rushed toward him, demanding he fix the situation and put me in my place. She clung to his arm, whining about how the hotel staff was treating her like a common criminal. Trent ignored her completely. He marched toward the concierge desk to salvage whatever dignity he had left, but his hands were shaking so badly he lost his grip on his heavy leather briefcase. The brass clasps snapped open. The briefcase hit the marble floor and its contents exploded across the lobby. Papers scattered everywhere, catching the attention of every wealthy guest passing through. Brianna yelled at him to pick up his important business contracts before someone stepped on them. I looked down at the documents scattered near my Italian leather pumps. I did not see a single tech contract or real estate proposal. I stepped forward and picked up a thick stack of legal papers stamped with bold red ink. They were pre-foreclosure notices addressed to Harrison and Camilla, his parents, regarding their sprawling ancestral estate. They were drowning in debt and about to lose their family home. Trent lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers out of my hand, but he was too late. My eyes had already locked onto the document lying right next to the foreclosure warnings. It was a life insurance policy. It was a freshly signed premium policy, insuring Brianna's life for exactly $5 million. The ink was barely dry. It had been activated exactly 3 days ago, right before the wedding, and the sole beneficiary listed on the policy was Trent. I stared at the $5 million figure printed on the crisp white paper. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Trent was not just a broke con artist trying to scam his way into my family's fake wealth. He was planning something far more sinister. He needed cash to save his parents from eviction, and my sister was worth more to him dead than alive. I picked up the thick stack of papers from the cold marble floor. The premium life insurance policy felt heavy and dangerous in my hands. I cleared my throat and read the bold print out loud so everyone in the lobby could hear perfectly. I announced that Trent had activated a $5 million life insurance policy on Brianna exactly 72 hours ago. I read the beneficiary line stating that Trent was the sole recipient in the event of Brianna's unexpected death. I held the crisp document up to the chandelier light, ensuring the massive dollar amount was visible to my sister. Brianna stared at the paper, her perfectly contoured face draining of all color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She finally turned to Trent, demanding to know why he would take out a $5 million policy on her life without telling her. Trent immediately went on the defensive. He adjusted his ruined designer collar and tried to put on his best corporate voice. He grabbed Brianna's arm and told her to calm down and stop acting crazy in public. He claimed it was just standard wealth management. He said high net worth individuals always protect their assets and that his family advisors insisted on setting up the policy to secure their financial future. I laughed out loud at his terrible lie. I told Brianna that wealthy people do not hide $5 million policies in a briefcase filled with foreclosure notices. I pointed at the red-stamped eviction warnings scattered across the floor. I told her that he was broke, desperate, and running out of time. Before Brianna could process the magnitude of what I was saying, the revolving doors of the hotel lobby spun open. My mother Yvonne and my father DeAndre rushed inside. They were still wearing their expensive post-wedding brunch attire. Yvonne took one look at the scene and immediately rushed to Trent's side. She put a protective hand on his arm and glared at me with absolute disgust. She screamed that I was trying to sabotage a beautiful marriage out of pure spite. DeAndre pointed a thick finger at my face. He ordered me to stop harassing his son-in-law. He loudly declared that Trent was a sophisticated investor and that I was just a bitter woman trying to find flaws where none existed. He refused to even look at the foreclosure notices scattered across the floor. He said Trent's family had old money and that I was embarrassing our entire church congregation by acting like a common street thug in a five-star hotel. He told me that my jealousy was making me completely delusional. I looked at my parents in absolute disbelief. Their golden child was holding proof that her new husband was financially ruined and potentially plotting her murder, but they chose to protect the white man who gave them proximity to elite society. I told DeAndre that he was defending a man who was actively planning to put his favorite daughter in a casket just to pay off his family estate. I told them they were trading Brianna's life for a country club membership. Yvonne shrieked that I was insane. She told Brianna not to listen to a single word I said. She wrapped her arm around Brianna's shoulder, coddling her like a toddler. Yvonne insisted that Trent was a powerful provider and that life insurance was exactly what smart, wealthy men do to protect their beautiful wives. Trent nodded eagerly, clinging to Yvonne's toxic defense. He praised DeAndre and Yvonne for being logical. He told Brianna that my corporate lifestyle had made me paranoid and cold. Brianna looked back and forth between me and Trent. For the first time in her life, her pageant queen confidence was completely shattered. But her greed and her lifelong conditioning won out. She desperately wanted to believe our parents. She desperately wanted to believe that she had secured a billionaire husband. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told me to drop the papers and leave. She said I was sick in the head for suggesting Trent would ever hurt her. She called me a monster who just wanted to see her fail. I stood my ground, holding the policy tightly in my grip. I told Brianna that I was not leaving until she woke up and faced reality. Trent took a threatening step toward me. He demanded I hand over his private property before he called the police. I told him to go ahead and call them because the authorities would be very interested in what I was holding. Right at that moment, my cell phone began to ring loudly in my pocket. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. It was the private medical concierge at Piedmont Hospital. This was the exact facility where Brianna had recently gone for a series of pre-wedding health screenings and routine blood work. Trent had specifically recommended the doctor she saw, claiming it was his family's top-tier physician. I held my phone up and pressed the speaker button, turning the volume all the way up. The lobby went dead silent. A clinical and highly professional voice echoed from the speaker. The medical administrator asked for Jada. I confirmed I was on the line. She stated that I was listed as the emergency contact on my sister Brianna's medical file, which I had updated years ago, and Brianna had never bothered to change. The administrator sounded deeply concerned. She told me she was calling to report a highly irregular inquiry regarding Brianna's recent blood work. She explained that the doctor Trent recommended had just flagged something incredibly suspicious. The administrator stated that someone had been making aggressive and repeated inquiries into Brianna's medical file over the past 48 hours. I kept my eyes locked directly on Trent, as the last remaining color completely vanished from his face. I asked the administrator to explain exactly what the inquiries were about and who was making them. The voice over the speaker delivered the final devastating blow. The administrator stated that Trent had been repeatedly contacting the lab technicians under the guise of husbandly concern. She confirmed that Trent had been requesting detailed information about how certain untraceable sedatives interact with Brianna's specific blood type. She said he was specifically asking how long those deadly chemicals take to completely leave the human bloodstream without detection. The echo of the hospital administrator's voice faded into the high vaulted ceilings of the hotel lobby. A horrifying, suffocating silence fell over the group. Brianna slowly turned her head to look at her new husband. The sheer terror in her eyes was unmistakable as the reality crashed over her. Trent was not just broke. I was actively calculating how many days it would take for a lethal dose of sedatives to clear her system so he could collect $5 million and save his parents from ruin. The sheer audacity of his plan hung heavily in the air. Trent took a trembling step toward her, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He started stammering out a desperate, fumbling lie, claiming he was just asking the doctors about her anxiety medication because he wanted to make sure she was safe during their tropical honeymoon. Brianna physically recoiled, stumbling backward until she hit the marble reception desk, knocking over a vase of fresh white roses. The flowers scattered across the floor, mirroring the sudden destruction of her perfect fantasy. My mother, Yvonne, and my father, DeAndre, stood completely paralyzed by the revelation. They were entirely unable to formulate a defense for the manipulative monster they had just happily welcomed into our family. Before the crushing weight of attempted murder could fully sink in, the heavy revolving doors of the hotel spun violently. Harrison and Camilla Trent's parents marched into the lobby. They were the picture of Southern white aristocracy, dressed in immaculate pastel linen and dripping in inherited arrogance. Flanking them was a sharp-suited corporate attorney clutching a thick leather briefcase. Harrison did not even look at Brianna. He barked at Trent, demanding to know why they were causing a scene in a public hotel instead of boarding a private jet. Trent pointed a shaking finger at me. He told his father that I had stolen his confidential documents and was trying to extort them. The lawyer immediately stepped forward, blocking my path. He puffed out his chest and began aggressively reciting a litany of legal threats. He stated that he was drafting an emergency injunction against me for corporate espionage, criminal defamation of character, and targeted harassment of a prominent local family. He promised to tie me up in endless, exhausting litigation for the rest of my life, draining every cent I had. He threatened to have me thrown into a maximum security federal penitentiary for daring to threaten his incredibly wealthy and socially prominent clients. He sneered, demanding I hand over my phone and all documents immediately, or face the full devastating wrath of his prestigious law firm. Camilla stepped out from behind her husband's shadow. She looked me up and down, her face twisting with pure, unadulterated disgust. The polite fake smiles she had used at the wedding venue were completely gone. She abandoned all pretense and weaponized her racism directly in front of my parents. Camilla sneered that I was nothing but a ghetto opportunist. She called me a loud, angry, bitter woman trying to extort their noble, aristocratic family because I was fiercely jealous of their pedigree. She proudly declared that my family should be falling to our knees in absolute immense gratitude that they even allowed Brianna to taint their pure bloodline with our presence. She told me I was acting like an uneducated common street thug who did not know her proper place in the presence of true generational wealth. Her words were designed to strip away my humanity and reduce me to a crude stereotype. The air in the lobby grew thick. I slowly turned my head to look at my mother. This was the moment. This was the absolute boundary. A white woman had just stood in public and hurled deeply racist, degrading insults at her black daughter. I waited for Yvonne to snap out of her delusion. I waited for DeAndre to utilize that booming pastoral voice to defend his flesh and blood. Instead, I witnessed the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever seen in my 32 years of life. Yvonne physically shrank back. She lowered her head and actually murmured an apology to Camilla. My mother folded her hands together and tried to soothe Camilla's temper, begging her not to let my behavior ruin the relationship between their families. DeAndre stood entirely silent, literally bowing his head to the perceived superiority of white wealth. They chose their fake social climbing over their own daughter's dignity. A cold, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I did not yell. I did not argue. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my iPad. I walked right past Camilla, completely ignoring her presence, and approached the hotel's main reception area. Mounted on the wall behind the panicked concierge was a massive smart television displaying the hotel's promotional luxury videos. With a few quick, precise taps on my screen, I overrode their wireless system effortlessly and mirrored my iPad directly to the massive display panel. The transition was instantaneous. The beautiful promotional videos vanished without a trace. In their place appeared a series of highly classified financial ledgers, stamped with bright red seals from the Federal Banking Commission, highlighting decades of severe financial mismanagement. I swiped to the next document displaying multiple default notices, property seizure warnings, and massive negative bank balances, all bearing the official crest of Harrison's highly esteemed real estate firm. The bold red numbers flashing on the screen were utterly catastrophic, proving they had absolutely nothing left. Harrison's aggressive corporate lawyer turned to look at the screen. The color instantly drained from the attorney's face. He recognized the documents immediately. He slowly lowered his leather briefcase and took a very deliberate step away from Harrison, distancing himself from a sinking ship. I turned to face Trent's parents, my voice echoing clearly across the vast marble room. I looked right into Harrison's arrogant eyes. I told him that his family's $40 million real estate debt was auctioned off last week on the private distressed asset market. I pointed to the massive screen displaying his absolute financial ruin. I told Harrison that I bought it. I explained that I am now his sole creditor. I hold the deed to your sprawling ancestral estate, the title to your collection of imported luxury vehicles, and the primary lien on your entire fraudulent real estate company. I smiled at the ruined aristocratic family standing powerless before me, watching their entire legacy evaporate into thin air. You are no longer elite, Harrison. You are officially bankrupt, and I own your future. Harrison stared up at the massive smart television screen in absolute horror. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a wrinkled linen suit. Camilla gripped his arm, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to comprehend the red numbers flashing before her eyes. Their aggressive corporate lawyer, who just seconds ago had been threatening to throw me in a federal penitentiary, suddenly grew very quiet. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out his smartphone, and rapidly typed in a few commands to verify the public financial registry. I watched the lawyer's eyes widen as he read the confirmation on his screen. He slowly lowered his phone and took a deliberate step away from Harrison and Camilla. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a sharp click that echoed through the tense lobby. He looked at Harrison with pure professional disdain and stated clearly that his firm requires a hefty retainer for clients facing total insolvency. He added that since Harrison's assets were now legally seized, his legal representation was officially terminated, effectively, immediately. Without another word, the lawyer turned on his heel and marched right out the revolving glass doors, abandoning them completely. Camilla let out a high-pitched shriek. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that it was a trick. She yelled that their family had been wealthy for 5 generations, and that a young black woman like me could never touch their ancestral fortune. I laughed an icy sound that made her flinch. I told Camilla that her generational wealth had evaporated over a decade ago. I walked right up to her, invading her personal space, forcing her to look at me. I explained exactly how Harrison had squandered every last dime of his great-grandfather's inheritance on terrible commercial real estate gambles and offshore crypto scams. I recited the exact dollar amounts they owed to various private lenders. I told Camilla that her designer clothes were bought on credit cards that were currently 30 days past due, and her country club membership was about to be revoked for non-payment. "You are completely broke, Camilla," I said, my voice steady and loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have been living on fumes and fake prestige for 10 years. I then turned my attention to my father, DeAndre, who was sweating profusely through his pastoral collar. I looked between him and Harrison, exposing the ultimate toxic secret that tied these two corrupt families together. I asked Brianna if she ever wondered why a family as deeply racist and elitist as Trent's would ever enthusiastically agree to let their only son marry her. Brianna stood paralyzed, still reeling from the revelation about her life insurance policy. I broke the devastating truth to her. I explained that it was never about love or breaking racial barriers. It was a calculated financial transaction. DeAndre promised Harrison a massive multi-million-dollar dowry disguised as a church community investment initiative. My father was planning to funnel $2 million straight from the megachurch's building fund into Harrison's failing holding company to save them from foreclosure. In exchange, Brianna got the fake prestige of marrying into a wealthy white family, and my mother, Yvonne, got to brag to her sorority sisters about her elite son-in-law. They literally sold Brianna to a desperate con artist to secure a social status that did not even exist. Brianna dropped to her knees on the marble floor, the realization physically crushing her. She looked up at Yvonne and DeAndre, begging them to tell her it was a lie. Yvonne averted her eyes, unable to face the daughter she had essentially auctioned off for country club clout. Harrison tried to puff out his chest and salvage some shred of his shattered dignity, but his shoulders slumped under the weight of his undeniable ruin. He grabbed Camilla by the arm and muttered that they needed to leave before the press arrived. I told him he could leave, but the valet would not be bringing his car around because my recovery agents had already towed his leased Bentley back to the dealership. Seeing Trent and his parents utterly destroyed, DeAndre realized that the white wealth he had worshipped was entirely fake. He realized that the only person in the room holding any actual power or money was me, the daughter he had spent 32 years treating like garbage. The shift in my father's demeanor was instantaneous and sickening to watch. He smoothed down his suit jacket, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and suddenly plastered on his most charismatic, booming pastor smile. He stepped right over Brianna, who was still weeping on the floor, and walked toward me with his arms wide open. "Jada, my brilliant firstborn," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth and paternal pride. "I always knew you had a mind for business. You are just like your father. You saw through these scammers and protected our family." DeAndre tried to place a hand on my shoulder, but I immediately stepped back, avoiding his toxic touch. He kept smiling, pretending we were suddenly a team. He told me that we did not need Trent or his bankrupt parents. He suggested that I take the church funds and merge them with my corporate assets so we could keep the wealth in the family. He promised that he and I could build an unstoppable empire together and that he would publicly announce my success to the entire congregation this Sunday. I was trying to pivot using his fake religious charm to manipulate me into sharing the fortune I had built on my own. I looked at the man who had stolen from working-class families to fund his own vanity. I looked at the father who had blocked me from entering the wedding venue just 2 days ago, calling me a jealous corporate drone. I did not yell or lose my temper. I simply offered him a bright, terrifying smile. I raised my hand and pointed a single manicured finger directly toward the grand revolving doors of the hotel lobby. I told DeAndre to save his business proposals for someone who cares. Tell that to the FBI, I said smoothly. The heavy revolving doors of the St. Regis lobby spun rapidly as a team of federal agents breached the building. They were dressed in sharp tactical windbreakers, with the letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. Their boots echoed loudly against the polished marble floor, cutting through the suffocating silence I had just created. The elite, pristine atmosphere of the luxury hotel evaporated instantly. Wealthy guests backed away, pulling out smartphones to record the spectacle. DeAndre slowly turned his head to watch the armed agents fan out across the lobby. His perfectly tailored pastoral suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform in waiting. The booming, charismatic megachurch leader vanished in the blink of an eye. He was trembling so violently that the heavy gold cross resting on his chest began to shake uncontrollably. The lead agent marched directly toward our group. He did not ask for permission to speak. He pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his tactical jacket and held them up high for everyone to see. He loudly announced DeAndre's full legal name and stated that he was under an active federal investigation. The agent read off a devastating list of criminal charges that echoed off the crystal chandeliers above us. Embezzlement, aggravated wire fraud, federal tax evasion, money laundering across state lines. DeAndre raised his hands in a pathetic, cowardly gesture of surrender. He tried to project his fake community activist persona one last time. He stammered that this was a terrible misunderstanding and a targeted attack on a prominent Black religious leader. He claimed loudly that he had spent his entire life uplifting the working-class families of Atlanta. The federal agent cut him off completely. He did not tolerate the religious performance for a single second. The agent looked DeAndre dead in the eye and dismantled his entire facade right in front of the stunned hotel staff and wealthy onlookers. The agent read directly from the federal indictment. He stated that the FBI forensic accounting team had spent the last 72 hours mapping every single bank account tied to the megachurch. He announced that DeAndre had systematically drained over $8 million from the community tithes and the charitable housing fund. The agent did not stop there. He publicly listed exactly where the stolen money had gone, exposing the deep hypocrisy of my family. He announced that donations meant to build affordable housing for single mothers had been illegally wired directly into Yvonne's private banking accounts to pay her exorbitant country club dues and fund her luxury sorority galas. He revealed that the Youth Scholarship Fund had been completely emptied to pay for Brianna's custom pageant gowns, her expensive cosmetic surgeries, and her fake influencer lifestyle. And worst of all, the agent confirmed that DeAndre had taken the church's emergency disaster relief fund and funneled it straight into Trent's bankrupt tech startup, attempting to buy his way into white high society. Brianna let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She looked down at her designer silk resort wear and the expensive diamond ring on her finger. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a freight train. Every single luxury she had ever enjoyed, her entire status as the golden child, was built on money stolen from hardworking families who trusted her father. She was not a wealthy elite. She was a parasite wearing stolen goods. Trent tried to slowly back away toward the grand staircase, attempting to distance himself from the collapsing megachurch empire. He whispered that he had no idea the investment money was stolen. He tried to claim he was an innocent victim of a corrupt pastor. One of the federal agents immediately stepped into Trent's path, blocking his escape. The agent firmly placed a heavy hand on Trent's chest and pushed him back into the center of the lobby. The agent informed Trent that receiving stolen federal funds across state lines made him a primary co-conspirator. Trent's face contorted in absolute terror as he realized he was going down with the sinking ship. DeAndre fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. The proud, untouchable megachurch pastor was openly weeping. He begged the agents to let him call his church elders. He pleaded for a chance to explain the financial discrepancies to his congregation. He promised he could pay the money back if they just gave him a few days to liquidate some assets. The lead agent shook his head in absolute disgust. He informed DeAndre that there were no assets left to liquidate. He stated that the church board had already been notified and the congregation was currently watching the raid unfold on the local morning news. DeAndre's entire reputation, his legacy, was permanently destroyed. He was no longer a respected community leader. He was a disgraced thief about to be marched out of a luxury hotel in handcuffs. Yvonne watched her husband sobbing on the floor. Her eyes darted wildly around the lobby, taking in the smartphones recording her ultimate humiliation. Her decades of social climbing, her desperate obsession with high society status, her entire fake aristocratic identity was burning to the ground. She realized that her sorority sisters and her wealthy country club friends were watching this live broadcast. She was going to be the absolute laughingstock of Atlanta. Panic consumed her completely. Yvonne dropped her expensive designer handbag and lunged toward. She fell to her knees right beside DeAndre and grabbed the fabric of my tailored skirt. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped my clothes with desperate bruising force. Jada, she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. Write a check. You have millions of dollars. You literally just bought a $40 million debt. You can fix this right now. Bail your father out. Pay the federal fines. Clear the church accounts. If you do not write a check right this second, our reputation in the sorority is ruined forever. We will be expelled from polite society. You have to save your family. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life calling me a failure. I looked at the mother who had locked me out of my sister's wedding just 2 days ago. She was not begging me to save her husband from a federal prison sentence. She was begging me to save her fragile social status. She only cared about what her wealthy friends would think. I calmly reached down and peeled her desperate clawing fingers off my skirt one by one. I stepped back, creating a cold physical distance between us. I looked Yvonne directly in her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I am not writing a check, Yvonne. I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I am not saving your reputation, and I am certainly not bailing out a thief. Yvonne gasped, clutching her chest as if I had shot her. How can you do this to your own mother? She wailed. I tilted my head and delivered the final crushing blow. I am not your daughter, Yvonne. I paused, letting the cold reality sink in. Not really. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the cold marble floor of the St. Regis Hotel. Yvonne stared back at me, her perfectly manicured hands still hovering in the air where I had brushed them away. Her mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to comprehend the words I had just spoken. DeAndre stopped his pathetic weeping for a fraction of a second, his head snapping up to look at me in sheer terror. He knew exactly what I meant. I knew the massive toxic secret he had forced my mother to bury all those decades ago was bubbling right up to the surface. But I was not going to give them the satisfaction of unpacking that massive biological bombshell just yet. I wanted Yvonne to sit in the suffocating anxiety. I wanted her to feel the exact same agonizing helplessness she had forced me to endure for my entire life. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look up at my face. I asked Yvonne if she remembered the winter I turned 19. I watched her eyes dart nervously toward the federal agents who were currently boxing up DeAndre's fraudulent financial documents. I demanded her full attention, snapping my fingers to force her gaze back to mine. I reminded her of the freezing December when I was working 3 separate jobs just to pay my own community college tuition because DeAndre refused to spare a single cent of his church salary. I was working the closing shift at a diner, restocking inventory and tutoring high school kids. The exhaustion completely destroyed my immune system, and I ended up hospitalized with a severe case of double pneumonia. I was lying in a crowded public hospital ward, struggling to breathe through an oxygen mask, terrified of the mounting medical bills. I kept an emergency medical fund hidden in a lockbox under my bed. It contained exactly $4,000. It was every single dollar I had scraped together, meant to keep me from drowning in debt if I ever got sick. I asked Yvonne to tell the entire lobby what she did while I was lying in that hospital bed fighting for air. Yvonne looked away, her jaw trembling. I did not let her escape. I raised my voice, ensuring every federal agent, every wealthy hotel guest, and every hotel staff member heard the absolute truth about this highly respected pastor's wife. I told them that Yvonne went into my bedroom, broke open my lockbox, and stole every single dollar of my medical fund. She did not take it to pay my hospital bill. She took my survival money and bought Brianna a custom beaded gown for a local homecoming parade. She left her 19-year-old daughter to suffocate under medical debt so her golden child could wave from the back of a rented convertible. Yvonne scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and defensive rage. She smoothed down her expensive emerald dress, trying to reclaim some shred of her shattered dignity. She yelled that I was completely twisting the story. She pointed at Brianna, who was still weeping silently on the floor. Yvonne shrieked that she was making a strategic investment for our entire family. She claimed that Brianna needed that custom gown to secure her spot in the elite social circles of Atlanta. She yelled that she was preparing Brianna to marry well so she could marry a wealthy man and financially support all of us. Yvonne actually believed her own delusional narrative. She stood in front of federal agents and defended stealing from her sick, hospitalized child by claiming she was just setting up Brianna to catch a rich husband. I looked at Yvonne with absolute pure disgust. I stepped right into her personal space, forcing her to back up against the reception desk. I dismantled her pathetic logic piece by piece. I told her that she did not secure a wealthy husband for Brianna. She secured a broke, desperate con artist who was actively plotting to put Brianna in a casket for insurance money. I told Yvonne that her brilliant social climbing strategy had resulted in her husband getting arrested by the FBI, her daughter losing her home, and her fake aristocratic in-laws abandoning them in a hotel lobby. I pointed out the brutal irony of her choices. I told her that she sacrificed my physical health and my financial stability for a completely empty fantasy. I reminded her that the daughter she stole from the daughter she called a tired corporate drone was currently the only person in the state of Georgia with enough capital to save her from a federal prison sentence. And I was choosing to let her burn. Trent had been standing quietly near the grand staircase, desperately trying to blend into the shadows while the federal agents processed DeAndre's paperwork. He had been listening to every single word of my confrontation with Yvonne. His eyes darted from the federal agents to the weeping Brianna, and finally to the furious, disgraced pastor kneeling on the floor. The terrifying reality of his situation finally clicked in his brain. The church operational funds were completely frozen. The massive multi-million-dollar dowry DeAndre had promised him was seized by the federal government. There was no secret wealth to bail him out. There was no elite family legacy left to hide behind. His fake tech empire was gone. His parents were bankrupt. And the FBI was currently securing warrants for his fraudulent real estate scam targeting working-class black families. Trent realized that staying in this hotel lobby meant spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He made a split-second decision driven by pure cowardly panic. Trent lunged forward, physically shoving Brianna violently out of his way. She hit the marble floor with a sharp cry. Trent sprinted toward the grand glass exit doors, his face twisted in sheer terror. "I am not going to jail for you people," he screamed at the top of his lungs. Trent slammed his hands against the heavy glass revolving doors, pushing with all his might to escape the luxury lobby. He did not make it past the vestibule. My private security detail had been standing silently by the perimeter this entire time, anticipating exactly this kind of cowardly retreat. Marcus, the lead of my security team, a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and possessed the build of a professional linebacker, stepped effortlessly into Trent's path. Trent collided hard with Marcus's solid chest, bouncing off him like a fragile bird hitting a thick window pane. Marcus reached down, grabbed Trent by the collar of his ruined designer polo shirt and hauled him backward with brutal efficiency. With a single powerful motion, Marcus hurled Trent right back into the center of the lobby. Trent hit the polished marble floor, sliding across the cold stone until he crashed directly into the legs of the lead federal agent. The impact knocked the remaining breath out of Trent's lungs, but it did not stop his malicious mouth. He scrambled to his knees, looking frantically at the armed agents surrounding him. Panic completely overrode whatever fake Southern gentleman manners he had left. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Brianna, who was still sitting on the floor in her expensive silk resort wear. "She is the one you want!" Trent shrieked, his voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous room. "She knew about the money. She is nothing but a worthless gold digger who was desperate to marry into my family." Trent's face twisted into an ugly racist sneer, completely dropping the progressive white ally mask he had worn for the past 2 years to infiltrate my father's church. He screamed that he despised my family from day one. He yelled that he was disgusted by how eagerly DeAndre and Yvonne bowed down to him just because he was a white man with a recognizable last name. He confessed that he only tolerated sitting through DeAndre's exhausting megachurch sermons because he knew he was walking away with millions of dollars in untraceable cash. He looked Brianna dead in the eye and told her she was a pathetic, shallow joke and that pretending to love her was the hardest job he ever had. Something inside Brianna completely shattered. The flawless local pageant queen, the untouchable golden child who had spent her entire life demanding absolute perfection from everyone around her, finally snapped. A guttural, animalistic scream ripped from her throat. Brianna lunged forward, launching her entire body at Trent. She tackled him to the marble floor, a flurry of manicured nails and flying silk fabric. She wrapped her hands around his collar and began violently scratching his face, tearing at his cheeks and neck with ruthless intensity. "You ruined my life," Brianna sobbed hysterically, her perfectly styled hair falling in wild tangled sheets across her tear-stained face. "You promised me a mansion. You promised me high society." Brianna clawed at Trent's face, drawing bright red lines of blood across his cheek. Trent flailed wildly, trying to push her off, but her blind rage made her incredibly strong. It took 2 trained federal agents stepping in and physically dragging Brianna backward by her arms to separate them. The sight of my pristine, elegant sister rolling on the lobby floor like a rabid animal fighting a broke con artist was the absolute destruction of my mother's decades of social climbing. Trent lay on the floor, panting heavily and bleeding from his face. He looked up at his parents, Harrison and Camilla, who were standing near the grand piano watching the chaos. "Dad," Trent begged, extending a shaking, bloody hand toward them. "Tell the agents. Tell them this was just a business deal. Tell them I was acting under the family trust." Harrison and Camilla looked at their son, and then looked at the federal agents holding warrants for wire fraud and embezzlement. In the ultimate act of elitist self-preservation, Harrison took a large, deliberate step away from his own flesh and blood. Harrison smoothed his wrinkled linen jacket and loudly declared to the lead FBI agent that he had absolutely no knowledge of Trent's financial activities. He claimed that Trent had been estranged from their family business for years due to his reckless behavior. Camilla chimed in immediately, her voice shaking with fake indignation to save her own skin. She stated that her son was a massive disappointment who had forged their signatures on those pre-foreclosure notices. She looked at Trent with pure, icy rejection and told the federal agents to arrest him because he was acting entirely alone. They threw their own son to the wolves to save themselves from a federal conspiracy charge. Trent let out a broken, sobbing cry as the federal agent hauled him to his feet and pulled his arms tightly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the lobby, sealing Trent's fate. DeAndre watched the entire scene unfold, his hands bound tightly in front of him. The mega-church pastor realized that his empire was entirely decimated. He had lost his stolen millions, his fake aristocratic son-in-law, his church congregation, and his freedom. Stripped of all his power, DeAndre turned his absolute venom directly toward me. He could not accept accountability, so he chose cruelty. DeAndre pointed his bound, shaking hands at my face. His eyes were wide and filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you won, Jada?" My father spat the words, dripping with decades of bitter resentment. You destroyed your own family just to prove a point. But look at you. You have no one. You drove away the only people who would ever tolerate you. You are a cold, unlovable corporate machine. You care more about balance sheets than human beings. DeAndre let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed chillingly in the quiet lobby. You are going to die alone with your money. The echo of my father's bitter curse had barely settled against the marble walls when the heavy electronic glass doors of the hotel lobby slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. The harsh afternoon sunlight poured into the room, framing the silhouette of a man who commanded absolute, undeniable authority. Marcus stepped over the threshold. He was a striking self-made African-American tech billionaire whose reputation in the ruthless financial sector preceded him everywhere he went. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit that moved seamlessly with his broad, athletic frame. Flanking him on either side was a highly polished legal team carrying thick leather briefcases and exuding pure corporate aggression. Every step he took commanded the room. The polished Italian leather of his shoes clicked against the marble, a sound of impending judgment. Marcus did not walk like a man entering a chaotic crime scene. He walked like a king inspecting his newly conquered territory. His presence was so overwhelmingly powerful that the armed federal agents instinctively stepped back to give him space. The panicked murmurs of the wealthy hotel guests died instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Even DeAndre stopped his pathetic, heavy breathing on the floor. Yvonne and Brianna stared at the entrance, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of wealth and power radiating from this man. They had spent their entire lives chasing the illusion of elite status, bending over backward for fake aristocratic approval, and right now they were staring at the absolute pinnacle of true success. Marcus did not look at my weeping mother or my disgraced father. He did not spare a single glance for Trent, who was still bleeding and handcuffed on the floor, shivering like a coward. Marcus walked straight through the center of the lobby, his dark, intelligent eyes locked entirely on me. The chaos of the arrests, the screaming, the shattered flower vases, none of it mattered to him. He stopped right in front of me, raising his large, warm hand to gently cup my cheek. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was a gesture of profound respect and deep, unwavering affection, displayed right in front of the exact family who had just declared me a cold, unlovable machine. Marcus turned his body slightly, keeping me safely tucked by his side, a united front against the people who had tried to destroy me. He looked down at DeAndre, who was still kneeling on the marble floor in heavy steel handcuffs. Marcus spoke with a quiet, resonant baritone that carried easily across the silent lobby, commanding every ounce of attention. "She is not alone," DeAndre Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "She is my business partner, my equal, and my fiancée." He raised my left hand, intertwining his strong fingers with mine to display the flawless custom-cut diamond resting on my ring finger. It caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above, sending brilliant, blinding flashes across the room. I watched the physical, visceral reaction rip through my mother and my sister. Yvonne's mouth dropped open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Her eyes darted frantically from the massive diamond on my hand to Marcus's expensive tailored suit and back to my face. The absolute horror of her terrible life choices crashed over her all at once. She had spent 32 years telling me I was too aggressive, too career-focused, and too unattractive to ever secure a decent husband. She had placed all her bets on Brianna, marrying a fake white real estate heir to elevate their family status into elite society. She had compromised her morals, her community, and her own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that Marcus literally owned. Now Yvonne was watching the daughter she discarded stand shoulder to shoulder with a legitimate African-American billionaire. Brianna let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the floor. Her fake designer resort wear was torn. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her con artist husband was currently facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Brianna stared at my engagement ring with a level of soul-crushing envy that looked physically painful. She realized that everything she had ever wanted, the vast wealth, the high society prestige, the ultimate social victory, belonged entirely to me. Her golden child status was absolutely worthless. I did not need to steal her spotlight because I owned the entire building, lighting it up. Marcus was not finished dismantling them. He turned his piercing gaze away from my pathetic family and looked directly down at Trent. The fake finance bro was shivering in his torn polo shirt, trying desperately to avoid eye contact with a man who possessed real, actual power. Marcus unbuttoned his suit jacket and casually slipped his hands into his pockets, staring at Trent with absolute disgust. He told Trent that the Securities and Exchange Commission did not just magically stumble upon his fraudulent real estate firm by accident. Marcus explained that he had personally funded the entire forensic accounting team that tore Trent's fake company apart layer by layer. He made sure that every stolen dime from the church was meticulously tracked and logged for the federal prosecutors to use in court. He announced to the entire lobby that he was the primary financial backer of the federal investigation. He had handed the FBI the exact blueprints of Trent's shell corporations on a silver platter, ensuring no loopholes were left open. Trent's eyes widened in sheer terror, realizing he had been actively hunted by a billionaire for months without ever noticing the target on his back. Marcus looked from Trent to DeAndre, ensuring both corrupt men understood exactly who had orchestrated their absolute destruction. Marcus smiled a cold, calculating smile that perfectly mirrored my own. He stepped closer to the handcuffed, looking down at the empire of lies they had built. "We do not just buy bad debt," Marcus said, his voice echoing with lethal precision. "We bury bad men." Marcus signaled to one of his lead attorneys, who immediately stepped forward and dropped a massive leather-bound ledger onto the marble reception desk. The heavy thud made Trent physically flinch. I walked over to the ledger and flipped it open, facing the pages toward my kneeling father and my terrified brother-in-law. I told them that financial crimes are rarely just numbers on a screen. They always have a human cost. I looked directly at DeAndre. I asked him if he recognized the addresses listed in the ledger. I read them aloud slowly and clearly so every person in the hotel lobby could hear. Streets in the West End. Neighborhoods in South Atlanta. Historically redlined districts where working-class Black families had spent generations fighting tooth and nail to maintain their homeownership. DeAndre's eyes darted across the pages, his breathing growing shallow as he recognized the addresses of his own church members. I explained exactly what Trent's fake real estate firm was actually doing. He was not building luxury condos or developing commercial high-rises. Trent was running a predatory lending syndicate. He was specifically targeting elderly, vulnerable Black homeowners who owned their properties outright, but struggled with rising property taxes or medical debt. Trent's agents would knock on their doors, offering predatory reverse mortgages and fraudulent home renovation loans buried in complicated, deceptive legal jargon. When these elderly residents inevitably missed a hidden balloon payment, Trent's firm would swoop in and aggressively foreclose on their family homes. He was stealing generational wealth from minority communities and auctioning their houses off to corporate gentrifiers for a massive profit. I watched the absolute horror wash over Brianna as she realized the blood money funding her designer shoes, her custom wedding gown, and her fake Maldives honeymoon was stolen directly from the grandmothers in her own community. I turned my full attention back to my father. DeAndre was staring at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I crouched down so I was exactly at his eye level, forcing him to look at the daughter he had cast aside. "You are a Black pastor," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal fury. "You stood at the pulpit every single Sunday demanding 10% of their hard-earned paychecks. You promised them spiritual salvation and community protection. You looked those families in the eye and told them you were building a sanctuary." I pointed at Trent, who was visibly shaking as the federal agents reviewed the ledger over my shoulder. "And then you took their tithes," I continued, not letting DeAndre look away for even a second. "You took the money those grandmothers placed in the offering plate, and you handed it directly to a white con artist who was actively stealing their homes. You funded the destruction of your own people just so Yvonne could brag about having a wealthy white son-in-law at her sorority luncheons. You sold out your entire community for a fake seat at a racist table." DeAndre began to sob uncontrollably, shaking his head back and forth. He stammered out a pathetic defense, claiming he had no idea what Trent's business model actually was. He swore he thought it was a legitimate urban revitalization project meant to uplift the neighborhoods. I stood up and looked down at him with absolute disgust. I told him ignorance is not a legal defense against federal wire fraud, and it certainly will not save his soul. I knew exactly who Trent was, but he chose to look the other way, because the fake prestige and the illusion of elite status blinded him to the truth. The lead FBI agent had heard enough. He snapped his notebook shut and gave a sharp, authoritative nod to his tactical team. The agents moved in on Trent with zero hesitation. Trent let out a high-pitched, panicked yelp and tried to scramble backward across the marble floor like a cornered rat. Two federal agents grabbed him by his expensive ruined polo shirt, hauling him violently to his feet. They twisted his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Trent's wrists echoed beautifully through the quiet hotel lobby. Seeing her precious son being treated like a common criminal completely broke Camilla's fragile aristocratic facade. The polite Southern racism she had weaponized against me earlier evaporated into pure chaotic hysteria. Camilla lunged forward, her beige silk dress catching on the edge of a velvet lounge chair. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that I was framing her son. She yelled that Marcus and I had fabricated the entire ledger to destroy her noble family because we were deeply envious of their historical pedigree. Camilla demanded that the federal agents release Trent immediately and arrest me for corporate terrorism. She screamed that a ghetto opportunist like me could never outsmart her highly educated son without cheating. She was hyperventilating, her face bright red, as she desperately tried to preserve the illusion of her white supremacy, even as her son was being read his Miranda rights. I did not engage with her racist meltdown. I did not raise my voice or defend my professional integrity to a bankrupt bigot. I simply reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my email application. Sitting in my outbox was a meticulously drafted press release. It contained high-resolution scans of Trent's predatory loan contracts, the financial wire transfers from DeAndre's church accounts, the audio recording of Camilla's racist remarks in the driveway, and the exact details of the FBI raid currently taking place at the St. Regis Hotel. I looked right into Camilla's furious, screaming face. I offered her a bright, victorious smile. I told her that she was right about one thing. I am an opportunist, and I never miss a perfect opportunity to expose a fraud. Without breaking eye contact with Camilla, I firmly tapped the send button on my screen. I announced to the entire lobby that the complete unredacted truth about their criminal empire had just been blasted to every major news outlet, investigative journalist and church board member in the state of Georgia. I told them the evening news was going to be spectacular. The quiet chime of my phone, confirming the email had been sent, sounded like a final death knell in the expansive hotel lobby. Camilla let out a breathless, horrified gasp as her phone and the phones of the elite lawyers standing nearby began to vibrate simultaneously with breaking news alerts. The federal agents did not give her a moment to process her public ruin. They hauled Trent forcefully by his arms, marching the struggling, sweating con artist toward the revolving glass doors. His desperate pleas for his parents to call their attorneys fell on entirely deaf ears. Harrison and Camilla were too busy frantically dialing their own crisis managers, trying to figure out how to salvage a real estate empire that I had already swallowed whole. With the federal agents securing the perimeter, and DeAndre kneeling on the floor in absolute disgrace, the illusion of my family's untouchable Atlanta dynasty completely evaporated. In the center of this wreckage sat Brianna. The undisputed golden child was still sprawled on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the scattered white roses from the shattered vase. She looked like a broken porcelain doll. I watched the terrifying reality of her situation wash over her face in real time. Her entire identity had just been mathematically erased. Brianna had spent her entire 28 years coasting on pretty privilege and my mother's stolen church funds. She had no college degree because she dropped out of her communications program to focus on local beauty pageants. She had no marketable skills because Yvonne had convinced her that being a high society wife was the only career she would ever need. Brianna looked down at her hands, trembling violently. She was staring at her massive diamond engagement ring, suddenly realizing that the stone was likely cubic zirconia or stolen property. She had no billionaire husband. She had no luxury penthouse waiting for her. Her parents were going to federal prison, and their bank accounts were locked by the government. She was wearing a $10,000 silk resort outfit, but she did not even have the cash to buy a fast food hamburger. She was absolutely utterly destitute. Brianna slowly raised her head and looked at me. She looked at Marcus standing powerfully by my side, his presence a fortress of legitimate self-made wealth. Brianna realized that the sister she had spent a lifetime mocking the woman she had called an ugly, bitter corporate drone was now the sole possessor of everything she had ever dreamed of having. The vanity and the arrogance drained right out of her. Pure desperate survival instinct took over. Brianna scrambled to her knees, ignoring the sharp pain as her bare legs scraped against the hard stone floor. She crawled directly toward me, her designer outfit bunching up around her thighs. She reached out with shaking hands, desperate to grab the hem of my tailored suit jacket. I took a deliberate step back, moving out of her reach. "Jada, please," Brianna sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, humiliating desperation. "You cannot just leave me here. We are sisters. We share the same blood. You have all this money now. You have this massive company and a billionaire partner. You have to take care of me. I have nowhere to go. Trent is going to prison and Mom and Dad are ruined. I will do anything, Jada. I will be your personal assistant. I will fetch your coffee. I will organize your files. Just please do not leave me on the street. I need you." I looked down at the weeping beauty queen at my feet. I felt absolutely zero sympathy. I asked Brianna what exactly she thought she could assist me with. I reminded her that my firm handles complex forensic accounting and distressed asset acquisition, while she could barely balance a checkbook without calling our mother to cover her overdraft fees. I told her that I do not employ women who steal from high school treasuries and frame their siblings. I looked her dead in the eye and reminded her of the exact words she had screamed at me just 20 minutes ago. I told her she had just called me a miserable monster and tried to physically assault me in a hotel lobby. I firmly stated that she made her bed with a murderous con artist, and now she was going to have to lie in it completely alone. Brianna let out a gut-wrenching wail, collapsing forward until her forehead rested against the cold marble. She begged and pleaded loudly, throwing away every last ounce of her carefully curated high society dignity. Watching her favorite daughter, crawling on the floor begging for scraps from the scapegoat, was the final breaking point for Yvonne. My mother had been sitting paralyzed near DeAndre, completely destroyed by the federal raid and her impending prison sentence. But Yvonne was a narcissist to her very core. If she was going to lose her freedom, her country club status, and her golden child's future, she was absolutely determined to ensure I did not get to walk away completely unscathed. If Yvonne was going down, she was going to drag my mental sanity down into the abyss with her. Yvonne suddenly pushed herself up from the floor, her hands bound tightly in front of her by the zip ties the federal agents had applied. She staggered forward, her eyes wide and manic, a terrifying smile twisting her tear-stained face. She looked at Brianna weeping at my feet and then glared directly at me with a level of toxic, vindictive hatred that chilled the air in the lobby. "Get up," Brianna Yvonne commanded, her voice echoing with a sharp, desperate cruelty. "Stop begging her. You do not need to beg this ungrateful, cold-hearted woman for a single dime. And you, Jada, you should not help her anyway." Yvonne took a shaky step closer to me, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malicious triumph. She was about to deploy the ultimate psychological weapon she had been holding onto for over 3 decades, just waiting for the perfect moment to break my spirit. "You do not owe us anything." Jada Yvonne spat the words, hitting the silence like physical blows. "You think you are so superior because you destroyed this family. But you never belonged in this family to begin with. You are not my biological daughter." Yvonne's voice echoed off the marble walls of the St. Regis lobby. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. "You are not my biological daughter." Brianna stopped her pathetic sobbing and stared up at our mother in total shock. The federal agents paused their movements. Trent, bleeding and handcuffed nearby, looked completely stunned. I stood perfectly still, my expression unreadable as I let Yvonne's venomous declaration wash over me. Yvonne pushed herself onto her knees, her zip-tied hands shaking with dark, manic energy. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. She thought she had just dropped a psychological nuclear bomb. She thought she was about to watch my identity shatter. You always wondered why you looked so different from Brianna. She spat a bitter smile, twisting her face. You always wondered why your features never quite matched mine. It was because DeAndre could not keep his vows. I had a filthy affair with a woman in his congregation, and you were the consequence. I glanced at DeAndre. The disgraced pastor was shaking his head frantically, trying to shush his wife. He knew that confessing in front of federal agents was a catastrophic mistake, but Yvonne was beyond reason. She wanted to hurt me more than she wanted to save herself. Your real mother was a naive woman, Yvonne sneered, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. She died in a car accident when you were just a baby. DeAndre brought you home begging for forgiveness. I was going to throw you both onto the street and ruin his career. But then the lawyers called. Yvonne let out a loud, sharp laugh that sounded completely deranged. She explained that the lawyers told them my dead mother came from a very quiet, very wealthy family up north. She had a massive, irrevocable trust fund waiting for me. Millions of dollars sitting in high-yield accounts entirely untouched. But there was a catch. The money could only be accessed by my legal guardians for the purpose of my upbringing and care. Yvonne leaned forward, her eyes burning with malicious triumph. That is the only reason I let you sleep under my roof, Jada, she hissed. You were a walking bank account. I adopted you legally so I could get my hands on those routing numbers. We did not build that megachurch with tithes alone. We used your dead mother's money to lay the foundation. We used your trust fund to buy the mansion in Buckhead. We used your inheritance to buy Brianna's first car, to pay for her elite private schools, and to fund every single luxury vacation we ever took. Brianna gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized her entire golden child existence was funded by the sister she had abused her whole life. Yvonne ignored her, focusing entirely on trying to break my spirit. Every time I bought Brianna a designer dress, Yvonne boasted I paid for it with your money. Every time I sent you to work a double shift at that diner while Brianna lounged by the pool, I was laughing behind your back. I made you scrub the floors of a house you essentially owned. You spent 32 years craving my love and trying to earn your place in this family, but you were just funding your own misery. You paid for your own abuse, Jada. We bled your trust fund completely dry and left you with absolutely nothing. Yvonne tilted her head back and laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound that chilled the room. You think you won today because you bought some debt and called the FBI, she mocked. But I won decades ago. I took the only thing your real mother ever left you, and I spent it on the daughter I actually loved. You are nothing but a discarded mistake. The entire hotel lobby went dead silent. The silence was so heavy it felt suffocating. The hotel staff looked at me with deep, profound pity. The federal agents looked at Yvonne with absolute disgust, having just listened to a woman happily confess to decades of severe financial child abuse. DeAndre had squeezed his eyes shut, weeping silently onto the marble floor, knowing his wife had just confessed to massive federal crimes on top of everything else. Marcus felt my posture shift. The towering billionaire business partner at my side felt the slight tension in my shoulders. His jaw clenched in furious anger. He stepped forward, his broad frame moving to shield me from Yvonne's toxic presence. He was ready to absolutely destroy her. He was ready to unleash his elite legal team and make sure Yvonne spent the rest of her miserable life in solitary confinement. Marcus opened his mouth, his voice low and lethal as he prepared to address the woman who had tormented the love of his life. But I did not need protecting. Not anymore. I reached out and placed my hand gently flat against Marcus's chest. I pressed lightly, silently, telling him to stop. Marcus paused, looking down at me with fierce protective concern. But as he looked at my face, his anger immediately melted into deep, profound respect. I stepped around him, closing the distance between me and my kneeling mother. I was not crying. My breathing was perfectly steady. My hands were not shaking. I looked down at Yvonne and I smiled. It was not a small, hesitant smile. It was the widest, brightest, most absolute, victorious smile of my entire life. The sheer, unshakable power of my reaction made the remaining color completely drain from her face as she realized I was not broken at all. The absolute silence of the hotel lobby stretched out for a few agonizing seconds. I wanted Yvonne to feel the exact texture of her own failure. Her chest heaved as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. She had thrown her ultimate weapon, a secret she had guarded with her life, and it had completely shattered against my armor. I tilted my head looking at her with nothing but pure cold amusement. I have known since I was 18, Yvonne. I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the vast room. I watched her entire body violently flinch. I let out a soft, chilling laugh. Did you honestly believe you could hide a multi-million-dollar irrevocable trust fund from the very person whose name was printed on the beneficiary line? Did you think a simple padlock on your mahogany desk drawer was enough to keep me in the dark? Yvonne opened her mouth, but her vocal cords completely failed her. DeAndre let out a strangled gasp from the floor, shaking his head in rapid denial. I did not let them look away. I stepped closer, forcing my mother, the woman who had stolen my identity long before today, to face the reality of my wrath. I told her exactly how it happened. I explained that 14 years ago, when she refused to give me a single dollar for my college applications, I went searching for my original birth certificate in her home office. I picked the lock on her bottom filing cabinet. I did not just find my birth certificate. I found the original legal documents from my biological mother's estate. I found the court mandates, the guardianship transfer papers, and the heavily redacted bank statements showing massive automatic deposits. I found the exact moment my real mother died, and the exact moment you two decided to turn my tragedy into your personal bank account. You thought I was just a quiet, obedient teenager? I continued, keeping my tone razor sharp. You thought I kept my head down because I was intimidated by Brianna's beauty and your aggressive social climbing. But I was not hiding, Yvonne. I was observing. I was taking notes. I was matching the dates of your sudden luxury vacations and Brianna's expensive pageants to the withdrawal dates on my biological mother's trust fund accounts. Brianna let out a loud, choked sob, covering her face with her hands. The golden child was finally processing the horrifying truth that every single designer dress she ever wore was paid for by the ghost of my dead mother. I turned my attention back to Yvonne, whose eyes were now wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. Why do you think I went into distressed debt and forensic accounting? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Did you think I chose the most grueling, demanding financial sector in the world just because I liked math? You spent my entire adult life calling me a boring corporate drone. You mocked my long hours. You ridiculed my late nights at the office. You told your fancy sorority sisters that I lacked the charm to succeed in high society. I leaned down so my face was inches from hers. I did not go to Wall Street to sit at a desk, Yvonne. I went to war. I spent the last 14 years weaponizing my education. I became a forensic accountant specifically to hunt you down. I spent every single night mapping out the exact financial labyrinth you and DeAndre built to hide my stolen inheritance. DeAndre began to sob loudly, his forehead pressed against the marble floor. I stood up and addressed the disgraced pastor directly, ensuring the federal agents were listening to every single word. I told him I knew all about his fake community organizations. I listed them out loud for the entire lobby to hear. The Atlanta Heritage Housing Fund, the Genesis Youth Initiative, the West End Community Uplift Project. I looked at the lead FBI agent and smiled. I told the agent that those were not charities. They were sophisticated shell companies. DeAndre and Yvonne had set up over a dozen fake nonprofit organizations through the megachurch. They would filter the massive withdrawals from my trust fund through these fake charities, classifying them as anonymous religious donations. Then they would wash the money straight into their private offshore accounts. They used the tax-exempt status of the church to launder my dead mother's money right under the nose of the federal government. Yvonne shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. Jada, please, she begged, her voice a pathetic, raspy whisper. We raised you. We gave you a home. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. I looked at her with pure disgust. You did not raise me, Yvonne. You held me hostage. You fed me the absolute minimum required to keep me breathing so you could maintain legal access to my routing numbers. You spent 32 years treating me like a pariah in my own house, while you drained the only legacy my real mother ever left me. You made me scrub the floors of a mansion that my blood paid for. You made me serve expensive appetizers to your racist country club friends, while you wore diamonds bought with my stolen grief. Marcus stepped up behind me, placing a warm, supportive hand on my lower back. He did not say a word. He did not need to. His presence simply amplified the absolute power I held in this room. He was looking at my parents with the cold calculation of a man who was ready to buy the prison they were going to rot in. I looked back down at Yvonne, who was clutching her chest, as if her heart was physically failing. I wanted her to know that her destruction was not an accident. It was a perfectly executed masterpiece 14 years in the making. I told her that I had tracked every single stolen cent. I had compiled digital copies of every forged wire transfer, every fake charity board meeting, and every single offshore deposit. I had built an ironclad, legally binding fortress of evidence that no highly paid defense attorney could ever dismantle. You spent your whole life pretending to be an elite, aristocratic Southern belle, I said, my voice ringing with total, absolute victory. You looked down on everyone around you, thinking your stolen wealth made you untouchable. You thought you built a high society dynasty. I stepped back, looking at the federal agents who were now moving in to secure the crying pastor and his terrified wife. I delivered the final devastating blow. You did not build a life, Yvonne, I stated clearly, matching her earlier cruelty with cold, hard justice. You built a heavily documented paper trail of grand larceny. Yvonne stared at me as if the ground beneath her knees had turned to glass. Her breath hitched as she tried to process the magnitude of a 14-year investigation into her financial crimes. But I was not finished. I had one final layer of this trap to unveil. I needed her to understand exactly why today of all days her entire empire was collapsing. I crouched down so I was eye level with my mother. I asked her if she thought it was a coincidence that federal authorities raided this hotel lobby on the exact day of Brianna's fake honeymoon. I asked why she thought my bank allowed a $338,000 charge to sit pending for 48 hours before triggering the freeze. Yvonne blinked rapidly, her mind scrambling to catch up. She stammered out that it was just a delayed transaction. She claimed that the venue management told her the corporate approval was simply taking an extra day due to the weekend. I smiled a sharp, victorious smile. I told her the venue management said exactly what my assistant instructed them to say. I knew about the forged signature the minute she submitted the contract. I saw the alert on my lap while sitting in my vehicle outside the wedding gates. I could have stopped it right then and there. I could have declined the charge and let the catering staff pack up before Brianna tossed her bouquet. But stopping the charge would have just been a simple credit card dispute. I said, my voice steady and commanding. It would have been a local civil issue. You would have played the victim and manipulated the local police into dropping the inquiry. I was not going to let you wriggle out of this, Yvonne. I needed something bigger. I needed you to commit a crime so undeniable that it would trigger an immediate federal response. DeAndre let out a low, agonizing moan from the floor, realizing exactly where this was heading. I stood back up and addressed both of them. When you stole my social security number to guarantee that massive wedding bill, you did not just sign a piece of paper. The venue's financial processing servers are located in a completely different state. By transmitting my stolen federal identification across state lines to secure a fraudulent line of credit, you committed aggravated identity theft and interstate wire fraud. Brianna let out another loud sob, clutching her head, as the severity of the situation crashed down on her. Her dream wedding was literally a federal crime scene. But that was not even the best part. I continued pacing in front of my disgraced parents. I looked at DeAndre, who was refusing to make eye contact. I told them their absolute greed was their ultimate undoing. They did not just use my stolen identity to pay the bill. They routed the vendor guarantees directly through the megachurch's operational banking portal to make themselves look like high-net-worth VIP clients to Trent's fake aristocratic parents. I pointed to the lead federal agent standing patiently waiting for me to finish dismantling my abusers. I looked back at Yvonne and delivered the final crushing blow. By linking an act of aggravated identity theft directly to the church's financial network, you legally connected your personal fraud to your corporate fraud. You turned a fake wedding bill into the predicate offense I needed to trigger the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Yvonne gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The RICO Act was for organized crime syndicates. I had just proven her family was exactly that. I needed you to commit one final undeniable federally prosecutable felony to trigger the RICO Act against the church's shell corporations. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I built the paper trail for 14 years, but I needed a catalyst to force the government to raid you without warning. You handed me the nail for your own coffin. You literally forged your own federal indictment just so Brianna could have a massive ice sculpture at her reception. Yvonne collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands. She was crying hysterically, wailing about her ruined life and her destroyed social standing. She begged DeAndre to do something to fix it, to call their high-priced lawyers or perform a miracle. But DeAndre was completely empty. The booming, charismatic pastor had nothing left to say. He knew the FBI had seized everything. There was no money left to pay a defense attorney. There was no congregation left to manipulate. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, signaling that my part was officially done. His heavy boots echoed on the marble as he closed the distance between himself and my kneeling parents. He did not offer any sympathy. He looked down at DeAndre and Yvonne with the cold professional detachment of a man who spent his career locking up predators. DeAndre Washington and Yvonne Washington, the agent said, his voice booming with legal authority. You are both under arrest for violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and federal tax evasion. The agent reached to his tactical belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent, he continued, reciting the Miranda rights with practiced precision. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Two more agents stepped forward, grabbing Yvonne by her arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. She screamed and thrashed, fighting against the grip of federal law enforcement, but she was completely powerless. They twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists sounded like music to my ears. A second pair of cuffs locked tightly around DeAndre's wrists. The pristine, untouchable facade of the Atlanta megachurch dynasty was entirely shattered, leaving nothing but criminals in its wake. The heavy steel doors of the St. Regis Hotel swung open, revealing the blinding flashes of news cameras and the deafening roar of local Atlanta reporters. I had promised my mother that the evening news would be spectacular, and I always deliver on my promises. The federal agents marched DeAndre and Yvonne right through the center of the grand lobby. The visual contrast was absolutely brutal and undeniably poetic. My mother was still wearing her custom emerald green gown, the heavy silk fabric dragging across the polished marble floor as she tried desperately to hide her face from the flashing cameras. She had spent her entire adult life meticulously curating a flawless image for her elite sorority sisters and her high society galas. Now she was doing the ultimate perp walk, her manicured hands bound securely behind her back by heavy steel cuffs. DeAndre stumbled awkwardly beside her, his pastoral collar looking like a cruel, twisted joke. He kept his chin tucked low to his chest, completely humiliated. The man who had commanded thousands of devoted parishioners every Sunday could not even look the press in the eye. The reporters shouted aggressive questions about the stolen charity funds and the working-class families he had so callously defrauded. The local community had already seen the detailed press release I blasted out. The betrayal cut deep through the heart of Atlanta, and the media was ruthless in their pursuit. Right behind my parents, the agents dragged Trent out into the glaring sunlight. The fake real estate heir was sobbing openly, his expensive designer polo shirt torn and stained with his own blood from Brianna's attack. He pleaded with the reporters, claiming he was framed, but his pathetic whines were drowned out by the sheer volume of the press corps. The federal vehicles sat idling against the curb, their red and blue lights painting the luxury hotel exterior in a stark criminal glow. I watched through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows as the agents pushed my parents and my brother-in-law into the back of the armored SUVs. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing their fate and erasing their fake empire forever. The massive media circus outside provided the perfect distraction for the other cowards in the room. I turned away from the windows to see Harrison and Camilla attempting to slip out through the side exit near the valet desk. The arrogant white aristocrats who had just called me a ghetto opportunist were literally scurrying away like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship. Harrison's face was ashen, his shoulders slumped under the crushing reality of his total financial ruin. I owned their $40 million debt. I held the deed to their ancestral estate. They had absolutely nothing left to their name. Camilla was frantically clutching her designer handbag, her beige silk outfit wrinkled and ruined from the stress. She did not even look back at the police vehicles hauling her only son to a federal penitentiary. They were abandoning Trent, completely prioritizing their own desperate escape over their own flesh and blood. They had agreed to let Trent marry a black woman solely to steal my church-funded dowry, and the second that stolen money vanished, their fake progressive inclusivity vanished right along with it. They were leaving the luxury hotel to return to a sprawling mansion they no longer legally owned to face private creditors they could no longer pay. I watched them scurry out into the sweltering Georgia heat, stripped of their generational wealth, and their weaponized privilege completely exposed as the frauds they truly were. With the police sirens fading into the distance, and the aristocratic in-laws vanishing into the streets, the grand hotel lobby fell into a haunting, heavy silence. The remaining wealthy guests had either retreated to the elevators or stood frozen in quiet shock, trying to process the magnitude of the raid. In the exact center of this massive opulent space sat Brianna. The undisputed golden child was entirely alone. She was still kneeling on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the trampled white roses from the vase she had knocked over during her panic. Her perfect salon blowout was a tangled, wild mess, and her expensive resort wear was ruined. For 28 years, she had coasted through life on a soft carpet woven entirely from my stolen inheritance and my mother's toxic favoritism. She had never paid a utility bill, she had never worked a late shift, and she had never faced a single tangible consequence for her selfish actions. DeAndre and Yvonne had shielded her from reality to maintain their delusion of a perfect high society daughter. Now her parents were locked in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison. Her supposedly billionaire husband was facing 20 years for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder against her. Her fake aristocratic in-laws had abandoned her without a second thought. The megachurch empire was seized by the federal government. Every credit card in her designer wallet was linked to frozen or bankrupt accounts. Brianna slowly looked around the empty, cavernous space, her eyes wide and hollow. The sheer magnitude of her isolation was physically suffocating. She clutched a ruined designer purse to her chest, her knuckles white from the strain, as she realized she was completely destitute. She finally lifted her heavy head and looked across the lobby at me. I was standing tall beside Marcus, secure, protected, and victorious. Brianna's chest heaved with a ragged, desperate breath. Her voice cracked, echoing pathetically in the silent marble room. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered, her tears spilling over her ruined makeup. "Where do I go?" I looked down at the ruined beauty queen kneeling on the cold marble floor. The cavernous hotel lobby felt completely empty now that the federal agents and the flashing news cameras had vanished into the humid Atlanta afternoon. Brianna was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her expensive silk resort outfit was crumpled and stained from her vicious physical fight with Trent. The heavy diamond engagement ring on her finger, which she had flaunted in my face just days ago, now looked like a cheap, heavy shackle tying her to a convicted felon. She was waiting for me to save her. She was waiting for the same dynamic that had governed our entire lives to kick in. She expected the scapegoat to swoop in and absorb the impact of her catastrophic mistakes. She thought that because we shared a childhood, I would somehow feel obligated to catch her as she fell from the highest social pedestal in the city. Brianna wiped a streak of mascara from her cheek. Her breath hitched in her chest. She reached one trembling hand toward my tailored suit jacket, trying to grasp the fabric. "Jada, please," she choked out, her voice raw and grating. "You heard what Mom said. You heard what she confessed to in front of everyone. They used me too. They lied to me my whole life about where the money came from. I did not know they were stealing from your dead mother. I did not know the church funds were illegal. You have to believe me. We are both victims here, Jada. We are sisters. You cannot leave me with absolutely nothing." I did not move an inch. I did not offer her my hand, and I certainly did not offer her my sympathy. I stared at her with absolute freezing indifference. I asked Brianna if she truly believed her own delusions. I told her that she was never a victim in that household. She was an active, eager participant in my daily torment. I reminded her of the countless times she had mocked my long working hours while spending my stolen inheritance on luxury handbags and private spa days. I told her that she knew exactly how cruel our parents were to me, and she weaponized that cruelty to secure her own golden child status every single day. She never questioned where the endless flow of cash came from because she simply did not care as long as it kept her wrapped in velvet and privilege. She happily watched me suffer under the crushing weight of medical debt and emotional abuse. I told Brianna that sharing a childhood roof did not make us sisters. It just made us prisoners in the same corrupt facility, and she was the favorite guard of the warden. Brianna let out a loud, agonizing wail, pulling her knees to her chest. "But I have no money," she sobbed, rocking back and forth on the hard stone floor. "The credit cards belonging to Trent are completely declined. My personal checking account is linked to the church operational funds that the FBI just froze. I do not have a car, I do not have an apartment, I do not even have a college degree because Mom told me I would never need to work. What am I supposed to do? Jada, where am I supposed to go tonight?" I looked down at her pathetic, trembling form. I felt the comforting, solid presence of Marcus standing right beside me. His quiet strength grounded me, reminding me of the authentic, powerful life I had built, completely independent of this toxic family structure. I looked back down at Brianna and let a slow, cold smile touch my lips. I asked her to think back to exactly 48 hours ago. I asked her to remember the moment I arrived at her lavish wedding venue exhausted from a 12-hour international flight. I reminded her of the exact words our mother had spat in my face while standing guard at those grand mahogany doors, preventing me from entering the celebration that my stolen identity was actively funding. "Remember what Mom said at the wedding venue?" I asked, my voice echoing with crisp, undeniable finality. "Only family is allowed." I paused, letting the profound weight of that rejection settle over her panicked mind. I watched her eyes widen as the realization of her ultimate isolation finally clicked into place. "You are not my family," I stated cleanly, severing the final invisible thread that tied me to her toxic existence. Brianna gasped, as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the massive lobby. She slumped forward, completely defeated, broken, and entirely alone. This was the exact justice I had engineered for 14 grueling years. I did not need to scream or tear her down physically. I simply needed to hand her the exact same complete indifference she had fed me my entire life. I reached into the interior pocket of my custom-tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the sleek leather of my wallet. I pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I held it between my index and middle finger, suspending it in the air above her kneeling form. I let the green paper slip from my grasp. The bill fluttered slowly through the quiet air, landing softly on the polished marble floor right next to her ruined designer purse and the scattered white roses. "Take an Uber," I told her, my tone entirely devoid of emotion. "Find a job. Welcome to the real world." I did not wait for her to pick up the green cash. I turned my back on Brianna forever. I linked my arm firmly through the powerful arm of Marcus. Together we walked purposefully toward the grand revolving glass doors. We stepped out of the luxury hotel and into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight, leaving the absolute wreckage of my toxic past completely behind me forever. Exactly 1 year later, that bright Atlanta sunlight was replaced by the cool, crisp autumn breeze of a private vineyard in Northern California. The air smelled of crushed grapes and fresh rain, a complete contrast to the suffocating, expensive perfume my mother used to wear. I stood at the edge of a lush green terrace looking out over rolling hills that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I was wearing a custom-tailored silk gown free of massive heavy jewels or ostentatious beads. There were no flashing cameras hiding in the bushes. There were no society reporters taking notes on who wore what designer label. There was no fake aristocratic posturing. There was only absolute profound peace. I walked down a pathway lined with white hydrangeas and natural greenery. At the end of that path stood Marcus. He wore a sharp black tuxedo, his dark eyes locked onto me with a level of adoration and respect that completely anchored my soul. Standing around him was his family, his parents, his siblings, his aunts and uncles. They were a family of incredibly successful self-made African-American professionals who had welcomed me into their fold with genuine warmth. There was no judgment about my untamed hair. There were no whispered microaggressions about my skin tone. They did not care about elite sorority affiliations or country club memberships. They cared about integrity, loyalty, and authentic connection. They were everything DeAndre and Yvonne had only ever pretended to be. When Marcus took my hand and we exchanged our vows under the open sky, I felt the final heavy, invisible chains of my childhood completely fall away. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter forced to kneel on a living room floor. I was a sovereign woman, standing at the peak of an empire I had built with my own hands. The reception that followed was intimate and breathtaking. We dined under strings of warm lights suspended between ancient oak trees. A live jazz band played softly in the background, while our closest friends and most trusted corporate partners laughed and celebrated. It was a gathering of people who actually liked each other. Later in the evening, Marcus and I slipped away from the dance floor to share a quiet moment in the vineyard's private tasting lounge. The room was lined with dark wood and velvet chairs. My lead security officer, the same massive man who had thrown Trent across the hotel lobby exactly 12 months ago, was standing near the doorway. He caught my eye and offered a brief, respectful nod before pointing toward the sleek, flat-screen television mounted behind the mahogany bar. The screen was muted, but the closed captions scrolling across the bottom were impossible to miss. I walked over and picked up the remote, turning the volume up just enough to hear the evening financial news broadcast. The anchor was delivering the final update on the most explosive federal corruption case in recent Atlanta history. The screen displayed courtroom sketches of DeAndre and Yvonne. The news anchor announced that after a swift and highly publicized trial, the former megachurch pastor and his socialite wife had been officially sentenced. They were handed 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge had shown absolutely zero leniency, citing their egregious abuse of charitable funds and their sophisticated money laundering network. Every single asset they owned had been liquidated by the government to pay restitution to the working-class families they had so ruthlessly defrauded. Their fake high society dynasty was erased from the map. The broadcast then cut to a photo of Trent. He was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit, his face pale and stripped of all his arrogant white privilege. The anchor reported that the fake real estate heir had received a crushing 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal facility. The federal prosecutors had successfully convicted him of aggravated wire fraud and predatory lending practices, specifically targeting elderly Black homeowners in red-line districts. The government had seized the last remaining fragments of Harrison and Camilla's ancestral estate, leaving his racist parents to live out their days in a cramped, rented apartment, entirely bankrupt and permanently disgraced. But it was the final segment of the broadcast that offered the most poetic justice. A local Atlanta news station was running a follow-up piece on the collateral damage of the church scandal. The camera panned to a busy fast food drive-through window on the outskirts of the city. The reporter was discussing how the family members of the convicted fraudsters were adapting to life without their stolen millions. The camera zoomed in on a young woman handing a greasy paper bag out of the drive-through window. She was wearing a cheap polyester uniform, a faded visor, and a plastic name tag. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, unstyled ponytail. Her face was exhausted and completely devoid of glamour. It was Brianna, the former local beauty queen, the untouchable golden child, who had once demanded a luxury honeymoon suite at the St. Regis Hotel, was now working a minimum wage shift just to afford basic groceries. The universe had handed her the exact reality check she so desperately needed. I watched the screen for a moment longer, internalizing the absolute fairness of the universe. I felt no lingering anger. I felt no pity. I simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I turned the television off, plunging the tasting lounge back into comfortable silence. Marcus stepped up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking at the dark screen. "They got exactly what they earned," Marcus murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble against my skin. "And you got exactly what you deserved." I turned around in his arms and looked up into his eyes. I reached over to the bar and picked up 2 crystal flutes filled with expensive vintage champagne. I handed one to my husband and kept one for myself. I looked down at the liquid bubbling inside the glass and realized the most important truth of my entire journey. The ultimate revenge was never just about destroying my abusers or orchestrating their federal indictments. The true victory was reclaiming the legacy my biological mother had left me and using it to build a life of profound, untouchable peace. I raised my glass, clinking it gently against Marcus's flute. The crystal rang with a clear, bright sound that echoed through the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of champagne, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. We turned and walked back out onto the terrace, rejoining our friends and our chosen family under the vast, starry California sky, living beautifully, successfully, and completely without them. The greatest lesson from this story is that true family is built on respect and not just biological ties. You are never obligated to tolerate toxic behavior, financial manipulation, or emotional abuse, simply because you share a bloodline. Your worth is not determined by people who intentionally underestimate you for their own selfish gain. The most powerful move you can make is walking away to build your own peaceful and successful reality. Realizing your immense value is the absolute ultimate armor. If you have ever found the courage to walk away from a toxic environment, hit like and subscribe.